I've always been someone who needs a clear plan. From a young age, I meticulously mapped out every step, finding security in the control I had over my life. When I met Stacy in college, it felt like the universe had finally given me something solid to hold on to. She was everything I had hoped for: smart, beautiful, and ambitious. We seemed like the perfect match. Our life together, by all appearances, was successful. We advanced in our careers, bought a house, and raised 2 amazing children. But over time, our marriage began to fracture. I'm not sure when it started. Maybe it was the long hours at work or the growing emotional distance. But those small cracks became deep chasms that neither of us could bridge. That's how I ended up sitting in front of a marriage counselor after 26 years, questioning if it was worth fighting for something that seemed beyond repair. Now, here I am, sitting next to my wife of 26 years, facing our counselor. My emotions are in turmoil, confusion, sadness, and anger all mixed together. Yet, there's also a hollow feeling, one I can't quite identify. The only thing I'm certain of is that the love I once felt for the woman beside me has faded. As I sit there brooding, I wonder whether it's still worth the effort to save this marriage, or if I should just let it end. I guess I'll decide after I hear what she has to say. Before I go on, let me introduce myself. My name is Todd Smith. I'm 50 years old, married to Stacy for 26 years, and we have 2 wonderful children, Mike and Terry. Mike is a freshman at a small private university, studying engineering on a baseball scholarship. Terry, our older child, is a sophomore at the University of North Carolina, pursuing a pharmacy degree. Stacy and I couldn't be prouder of them. Stacy and I met like many people did in the late 80s, at a college party during my junior year. It was an open fraternity party, and I was hanging out with friends in the backyard when I saw her on the back porch smoking. Even from about 20 yards away, I could tell she was beautiful. Long brown hair, a slim, athletic figure. But what really drew me in were her eyes. Even from that distance, her blue eyes were captivating, like the deep waters of an endless ocean. My friends kept talking to me, but I couldn't take my eyes off her. I must have looked like a fool, standing there in a trance. Finally, after a few minutes, my best friend Sean asked, "Are you going to talk to her, or just watch her all night?" His words snapped me out of it, and I prepared to make my move. But before I could, she smiled at me, then turned and went back to the party. Sean urged me to go get her number before it was too late, and I realized I had to act fast. I spent the next 15 minutes searching through the crowd until I finally saw her getting into a car with some friends, ready to leave. She glanced at me from the window, gave me a quick smile, and then she was gone. I didn't see her again for almost 2 years, though I often thought about her smile and those beautiful eyes. The University of Georgia is a big place, so it's not surprising that I didn't run into her again despite spending a lot of time searching. I even enlisted Sean's help, and we started eating at different cafeterias around campus, hoping to see her. But a year passed, and I still hadn't found her. By the time my senior year started, I decided to focus on other things. I was on track to earn a degree in finance, and job offers from big firms in Atlanta were rolling in. Everything was falling into place. Then one day, as I was sitting at a traffic light, I saw her again, sitting at a table about 200 yards away, smoking a cigarette. I wasn't sure it was her at first, but when the light turned green and I didn't move, the cars behind me started honking. She turned to see what was happening, and that gave me a good look at her face. In that moment, I knew I had to meet her and talk to her. It was probably reckless, but I parked the car, turned it off, and walked straight toward her. The cars behind me honked and shouted, but I didn't care. I needed to meet her. As I got closer, she looked confused but recognized me. She stood up, put out her cigarette, and walked right up to me, stopping just inches away. Her friend watched silently. We stared at each other until she finally smiled and said, "I'm Stacy. You should have gotten my number before I left." Stunned, I replied, "I tried, but you were already leaving." She handed me a notepad with her number saying, "Don't lose it, and you better get your car before it's towed." As I turned to go, she surprised me with a kiss and said, "Call me soon." Later that night, we talked for hours. Stacy told me she was only on campus by chance that day, meeting her friend Tony for lunch. I shared how I'd searched for her for months, and she admitted she'd thought about me too, wondering what happened to the guy who stared at her at the party. We laughed about it, and she revealed that her search for me even caused her breakup with her then-boyfriend. I asked her out, and she eagerly agreed. Our first date lasted until 2 a.m., ending with a kiss at her door. As I drove home, I thought, this could be the girl I spend my life with. The next morning, I called her and she teased, "What took you so long?" Confused, I said, "It's only been 7 hours since I kissed you goodnight." She laughed and replied, "I'm just teasing. I couldn't stop talking about last night with Tony until 5 in the morning." I smiled and asked her out again for that evening, and she quickly agreed. Our second date was even better. After dinner, Stacy suddenly asked, "Would you rather go to my place instead of the bar?" With a playful smile, she added, "It'll be quieter, more engaged, and we'll be closer to my bed if you decide to stay the night." Surprised but intrigued, I agreed. We never finished that bottle of wine. We emerged from her bedroom 2 days later. Making love to Stacy was nothing short of magical, unlike anything I'd experienced before. After 3 rounds in 18 hours, I was exhausted and slept for 10 hours straight, curled up next to her. If Tony hadn't woken us up, we would have missed class on Monday. From that point on, we were inseparable. I spent all my time at Stacy and Tony's apartment. My roommate Sean was thrilled. He and his girlfriend Beth could now walk around our place without any concerns. We all graduated that spring and landed good jobs in Atlanta. I became a junior accountant, Stacy started in marketing, and Tony went to law school, eventually becoming an attorney in downtown Atlanta. The biggest surprise was Sean and Beth joining the Atlanta police force. Their carefree lifestyle didn't seem to fit law enforcement, but Sean explained that they felt it was time to grow up, and there was no better way than joining the force. Our group of friends stayed close, meeting weekly, and even more often during football season, especially on Saturdays for Bulldogs games. We had barbecues, hung out, played games, went out to eat, and watched movies. Everything close friends do. Life was good for all of us. One evening, Stacy and I were on our back porch, reflecting on our blessings. We had money, a beautiful house, nice cars, and enjoyed great vacations, both alone and with friends. I was now the vice president of finance at my company, with a corner office in my future. Stacy had become the head of Southeast marketing for a major athletic shoe company and seemed to be thriving in her career, or so I thought. As she sipped her sparkling wine, she looked at me with that familiar sparkle in her eyes and asked, "Did you notice I quit smoking a few months ago?" I nodded, smiling. "Yes, but I didn't mention it in case it tempted you to start again." She smiled back, but then her expression turned serious. "That's not the only thing I've stopped." Puzzled, I asked, "What else?" "In recent months," she began softly, "I've also stopped taking birth control pills. We're going to have a baby soon." I was stunned, thrilled, and terrified at the idea of becoming a father again after all these years. It marked a new chapter in our lives. Now I'm the president of our company, which has grown to $150 million in annual sales, with a growth rate of over 15% per year. My salary is excellent, and my annual bonus often exceeds 200% of my base pay. People credit our success to my sharp mind, but I believe it's my willingness to take risks that got us here. Stacy is now the senior vice president of marketing at the same shoe company, leading a large team and controlling the Southeast market. We've invested wisely in the stock market, earning more in a single day than our annual salaries combined. We have over $18 million in the bank, and our future looks bright. Our children, who have been the center of our lives for the past 22 years, have graduated from college and are thriving in their careers. But then, fate dealt us a blow. One Friday night, I was on our back porch relaxing with a beer, blues music playing in the background. Stacy had just returned from a week-long retreat in the North Georgia mountains with her firm. I hated those retreats because there was no cell service, so we couldn't communicate. I heard her place her wine glass on the table next to me, and then the sound of her lighting a cigarette, something she hadn't done in almost 20 years. Surprised, I opened my eyes and saw her. It was clear something was wrong. The blue eyes I had loved for 27 years were empty, something I had never seen before. I said nothing, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she took a long sip of wine, a deep drag from her cigarette, looked me in the eyes and said, "I cheated on you. I'm so sorry." My mind raced with confusion, anger, and pain. I could barely process her words. "What did you just say?" I asked in disbelief. She lowered her head and repeated, "I cheated on you. I'm so sorry." Instantly, rage consumed me. I felt utterly betrayed by the woman I loved, the only woman I ever loved. I couldn't speak or think. I wanted to lash out to hurt her, knowing I was close to doing something I'd regret. I pulled myself together, stood up, and went inside, overwhelmed with shock. I needed to escape, so I ran.
I sat on the back porch for 2 hours crying, waiting for Todd to return so we could talk. At first, I thought he had just gone inside for another drink, but when he didn't come back, I assumed he'd gone to bed. Eventually, I went to find him, but he was gone. A quick call to his phone confirmed it. He'd left without it. I had destroyed everything that mattered. After crying most of the night, I woke up still in my clothes, alone in the house. Todd hadn't returned, and I started to worry. We'd rarely gone more than a day without talking in our 27 years together. But loving people don't sleep with others. I spent the entire day in tears. Finally, I called Tony, my best friend of nearly 30 years. She sensed the urgency in my voice and came over immediately. When she arrived, she found me in our bedroom still crying. She smelled the cigarette smoke and knew Todd must have left. She hugged me and asked, "Did Todd cheat on you?" I could only look at her, still crying. She understood immediately. I was the one who cheated, I confessed. I betrayed him. She held me as I cried until I fell asleep. When I woke up 2 hours later, she was still there, reading a magazine. She gently asked if I wanted to eat, drink, or talk. I wasn't hungry, but a glass of wine sounded good. I told her everything, from the retreat until she arrived. She listened without judgment, like a true friend. Afterward, she reassured me, "You and Todd will get through this." She reminded me that she, her husband, Beth, and Sean were all there to help. "That's what true friends are for," she said. By evening, it was clear Todd wasn't coming back anytime soon. I called my kids to see if they had heard from him, but they hadn't. I lied, saying he was probably away with friends. They were annoyed, but I reassured them he had likely told me, and I'd just forgotten. That night, Tony stayed with me, and we drank wine until I fell asleep. The house now reeked of cigarettes and booze, a stark contrast to how things had been just 48 hours earlier. Sunday came and went, and Todd was still gone. Tony and I spent the day drinking and crying together. On Monday, I called my boss and requested a few days off, claiming exhaustion from the retreat. He was understanding and told me to take the week off, but there was still no word from Todd. By Tuesday, Tony decided we needed more help. We called Francie, Todd's executive assistant, who had been like a second wife to him for over 10 years. Francie said Todd had emailed from a personal account, saying he was taking 2 weeks off and wouldn't be available by phone or email. My heart broke even more, and I cried for hours. Realizing we needed professional help, Tony called Sean and Beth. They came over, listened to my story, and asked for details, their police instincts kicking in. I begged them for help, and without hesitation, Sean said, "I'll find Todd." Beth looked at me and vowed, "If it's the last thing I do, I'll ruin Peter's life."
I ended up in Key West, Florida without knowing why. I'd never been there and I didn't know anyone in South Florida. I just drove south until I couldn't go any further. I found a cheap hotel near the beach, paid for 2 weeks in cash, and isolated myself. I didn't want Stacy to find me and needed time to think. To avoid being tracked, I used only cash and emailed Francie from the hotel's computer saying I was taking a 2-week vacation. I needed this time to figure out my life after Stacy's shocking confession. Being alone with my thoughts was torture. Every nightmare about Stacy and her lover haunted me. Was he better than me? Did our friends know and laugh behind my back? These thoughts consumed me, so I tried to stay drunk as much as possible. I kept asking why. Why did this happen? But I couldn't face the answers. In Key West, you can stay drunk, and no one cares. Even at 9 a.m., people ignored me. I wore the same clothes every day and let my beard grow unkempt. After a few days, I no longer saw the president of a multi-million-dollar company in the mirror. I saw a stranger, a depressed, angry, stinking drunk wandering the streets of Key West. How far I had fallen.
Finding Todd was harder than expected. He had vanished without a trace. Beth and I pulled out all the stops trying to trace his credit and bank cards, but they hadn't been used. Cameras showed him heading south on I-85, but once the DOT cameras ended, so did Todd's trail. We figured he was in South Georgia or Florida, but tracking a black BMW in that area was nearly impossible. It's too common. As a last resort, I called a friend at the Florida Highway Patrol and requested a bolo on Todd as a person of interest. With my captain's help, this was the closest we could get to using official resources to find him. Meanwhile, Beth focused on Peter, knowing everything about him within hours. She took his phone, which Stacy had grabbed in a panic, and planned to hack it. When Tony reminded her this wasn't legal, Beth insisted, "I think she was pilled. She's a sufferer." That ended the discussion. Beth was out for revenge, convinced Stacy was innocent. Beth cracked Peter's phone in 4 minutes. His password was his birthday in reverse. She matched numbers from his phone with the Atlanta police database and found a lead. The name AK was linked to a known ecstasy and rohypnol dealer. Beth was determined to make Peter pay. She enlisted 2 friends from the force, and they began tailing Peter and AK, bending the law. On the first night, they caught Peter buying pills from AK at a club. Beth and her friends lured him in, pretending to be interested. While dancing, Peter slipped something into Beth's drink, and I caught it on video. I signaled and they arrested him, breaking his nose in the process. Beth's vow was fulfilled, but now I had to find Todd before he made a decision that could ruin his, Stacy's, and their children's lives.
Making friends is easy when you don't care. Within a week, I knew more people in Key West than I did in Atlanta. I became a regular at the bars, but despite the familiarity, I still felt broken and lost. I knew I couldn't keep running from my problems forever, but I didn't know what to do next. Then I met Kitty. One night, as I sat at the bar, drinking and wallowing in self-pity, she sat next to me. She introduced herself as Kitty, and my first thought was, who names their child Kitty? She was 23, short, blonde, and bubbly, with a sweet smile and braless confidence. She looked at me and said, "Todd, let's walk on the beach alone." My mind raced, thinking of my wife, my vows, my life. This wasn't who I was. But despite my reservations, I found myself taking her hand and walking out the door. We walked in silence for about 40 minutes, eventually reaching a secluded beach. Along the way, she bought a small bottle of Jack Daniels. We sat down and she began asking about my life, my kids, my business, my hobbies. She listened intently, never judging, but she never mentioned Stacy. After an hour, she handed me the bottle and asked, "What's your wife's name?" I hesitated, then replied, "What makes you think I'm married?" She smiled and said, "I've watched you for days. The emptiness in your eyes only comes from someone you love. You're still wearing your wedding ring, so did she die or cheat on you?" I quietly answered, "She cheated. Her name is Stacy, and a week ago she told me." We sat in silence, passing the bottle between us. Finally, Kitty asked, "Do you love her?" I thought for a moment and said, "Yes. That's why it hurts so much." "Tell me what happened," she whispered. I shared bits and pieces of my story, from meeting Stacy to leaving Georgia in shock. When I finished, we sat in silence again. After a while, Kitty asked, "Do you want to hear my story? It might help." Curious, I replied, "Sure. I have all night and maybe the rest of my life." For the next hour, Kitty shared her story. She was born in rural Florida, far from the tourist attractions, where a 2-unit trailer was a luxury. Her father, who was 54, left shortly after she was born. He had nicknamed her Kitty, though her real name was Tanya, which she preferred. Her mother, a waitress, tried her best to raise her, but after her grandmother died when Kitty was 12, she was mostly on her own. Despite good grades, Kitty believed her only way out was to find a man to take care of her. At 19, she married Billy, who soon lost his job, became angry and abusive, and spent their savings on drinking and other women. Things got worse when Billy suggested sharing her with his friends, leading to a final straw when he knocked her after she confronted him about spending their rent money on pills. 3 months ago, after that incident, Kitty packed her things, took the car, and drove to Key West. She lived in her car for 2 months until she saved enough to rent a room from a friend. As she spoke, she never looked at me. Her story made me realize how different our lives were. After a pause, she said, "All I wanted was to study, become a nurse, and find someone who loves me as much as I love them, to have the life my grandmother wanted for me." For the first time in a week, I thought about something other than Stacy. Kitty then said, "I've seen you feeling sorry for yourself, trying to drink away the pain. But you love your wife. Otherwise, you would have already hooked up with someone. Since you love her, it's time to fight for her. You're better than this, and I'm going to help you." I was taken aback. I thought she was interested in a fling, but instead she was challenging me to get my life together. All I could say was, "But how?" Kitty looked me in the eye and said, "If you really love her, go back and fight for her. Show her what she's lost. If she still chooses to leave, at least you'll know you did everything possible to save your marriage." Kitty then took charge. She stood up and said, "I'll take care of everything for the next 24 hours if you let me." First, she insisted I get cleaned up, saying I smelled terrible. Then, She urged me to figure out why Stacy had cheated and what I was going to do about it. We got back to my shabby hotel room around 3 a.m., and Kitty commented, "This is where you're staying?" Her disappointment made me feel ashamed. She told me to go to bed, saying, "In the morning, we'll start putting your life in order, whatever that means." I collapsed on one bed, and she slept on the other. When I woke up at 10 a.m., Kitty was already up, dressed, and smiling. She said, "I'm taking the day off from my waitress job because I have more important things to do." Her smile warmed me. After showering, Kitty told me, "Get back in the shower and shave. I'm not going out with you looking and smelling like a homeless person." After my second shower, Kitty asked, "Where are your other clothes?" I replied, "I don't have any. I left home and have been wearing these for over a week." She was almost sick on the spot. Refusing to tolerate this, we headed to a beat-up 1992 Toyota Corolla. She got in the driver's seat, explaining the door was broken. I put my foot down, saying, "No way. We're taking my BMW M3. You'd think it was her first time in a luxury car as she settled into the leather seats. Until then, she probably still saw me as someone barely scraping by. We spent the next few hours shopping, which was fun for both of us. I ended up spending $2,500 on clothes for us both. It took me 30 minutes to convince Kitty that I could afford it, and that it was my way of thanking her for making me smile for the first time in a week. Afterward, we packed the clothes into the car and went to lunch at the Hot Tin Roof in Key West. It was clear Kitty had never been to a place like that before. We enjoyed the best steaks, lobsters, oysters, desserts, and wine. 3 hours later, Kitty came up with Operation Todd Retrieval. We were a little tipsy when we named it, but the idea was for me to meet Stacy and figure out my next steps. Kitty was quickly becoming my guardian angel.
When Todd's credit card was used in Key West, I was notified immediately. Now that we knew where he was using his cards, all that was left was to find him and make him hear Stacy's side of what happened with Peter. Time was of the essence. We had discovered that Peter had pilled Stacy at the retreat and had sex with her, taking photos to blackmail her into getting him promoted to vice president of marketing when they returned to Atlanta. How did we find out? Let's just say, you should never cross an Atlanta cop out for revenge. After his arrest, Peter was put in a room with 3 very angry officers. He quickly confessed everything to Beth, even admitting to cheating on his taxes. I first called Beth, then Tony, to get their advice on how to break the news to Stacy. She'd been at home all week, either drinking heavily or falling apart. It was only a matter of time before her kids found out and came home to help, or Stacy lost everything, her job, her life, everything she'd worked so hard to build. Tony suggested a plan. Fly to Key West today and find Todd. As his best friend, you need to explain what happened and convince him it wasn't Stacy's fault. He'll believe you. Get him to come home and talk to her before it's too late. Tony also took it upon herself to tell Stacy that Todd's credit cards had been used in Key West and that I was on my way to find him. She stressed that finding the cards didn't mean we'd found Todd, but we were on the right track, and Stacy's best friends were with her while I searched. Beth agreed, but suggested buying 2 tickets. 2 people searching for Todd are better than 1, she said.
It's incredible what good food, wine, and company can do for your mood. I even smiled a few times during lunch. I felt better, refreshed, and ready to face the world. My pain hadn't disappeared. My heart was still aching from my wife's confession, and I knew life would never be the same. But at least there was hope that I could move forward. A 23-year-old cocktail waitress with little hope for a normal life had pulled me out of my personal hell and back to a reality where I still had a life, one for myself, my children, and maybe even my wife. When the bill came, I paid and asked Kitty, "Have you ever been to Atlanta?" She looked puzzled. "No," she replied. "Why?" "I want you to come with me," I said. "All expenses paid. I need your help and support. You pulled me out of my hell, and now I want to help you out of yours. Come with me when I meet Stacy. You're the only person I trust right now. I don't know the full extent of what Stacy did or who knew and laughed behind my back, but you were there for me at my worst, for no reason other than to help. Please come with me. I need you." 30 minutes later, we were in my BMW driving north to Atlanta with our new purchases. In Homestead, I withdrew $350 from an ATM and called my best friend Sean from a payphone, letting him know I was alive and on my way to Atlanta, expecting to arrive in 2 days. I left a voicemail and also called Beth. I thought about calling Stacy or Tony, but I wasn't ready for that yet. By 9 p.m., we stopped at a hotel for the night, exhausted from shopping, wine, and driving. This time, I opted for a 5-star hotel, paying cash for the room, though a credit card was needed for the deposit. Kitty used hers to secure the room, as I was still worried about being tracked. I wasn't ready to be found. I was still grieving and felt safer in my anonymity.
When we landed in Key West, I turned on my phone as we taxied. There was one missed call from an unknown number. It was Todd. He said he was calling from a payphone and was on his way back to Atlanta expecting to be there in 2 days. Saying I was relieved is an understatement. I tried calling back but ended up speaking to a couple from Omaha who had answered the ringing payphone outside a diner. Beth got a similar message from Todd asking us to let everyone know he was coming home. She quickly called Stacy and Tony to share the news. I could almost hear Stacy's sigh of relief, knowing Todd was alive and heading home, giving her a chance to face him and ask for forgiveness. Beth pointed out that Stacy hadn't consented to the situation. As bad as it sounds, Beth said, if Todd can't accept what Stacy has to say, then he's not the man we've known for 30 years. And if he can't forgive her, I'm done with him. After Beth hung up, she told me, our group of friends from the University of Georgia will handle this. And once things settle down, I will find Peter and make him pay for the pain he caused. We all believed her. Within 2 hours, we found a hotel, rebooked our flights to Atlanta for the next day, and I fell asleep next to my loving wife, knowing that if I ever let her down, no one would ever find my body.
The day I had been dreading for over a week had arrived. I had to meet Stacy and find out the truth about her cheating. What would this conversation be like? Would I have to hear about the man she slept with, how he was better in bed, or how she let him do things she never allowed me to do? Or would she beg for forgiveness, claiming it was just a one-time mistake, that she only loved me, and that it didn't mean anything? Just sex didn't mean anything? I thought bitterly. She let another man take what was supposed to be mine. We promised to reject everyone else, and she broke that vow. How could I ever forgive her? Even if she says it was a mistake and she loves me, how will I ever forget the image of her with another man? I must have been lost in thought for hours before Kitty spoke. She saw how much the upcoming meeting was tormenting me. Todd, relax, Kitty said, her voice calm but firm. What's done is done. There's no point in letting it eat you up inside. She encouraged me to talk about what was bothering me so she could help me get through it. After I had cried out all my fears, we crossed the Georgia border, just a few hours from home. At that point, Kitty showed a new level of maturity. She offered to drive so I could make some calls from her phone. I think she just wanted to drive something nicer than the old Corolla she'd had since she was 16. Who should I call? I asked after we switched seats. Call a few marriage counselors and see if anyone can talk to you about your situation, she suggested. I never knew you could do therapy over the phone, but with a credit card, anything's possible. After some time, I found a certified marriage counselor, Dr. Blake, who was willing to talk. At first, she insisted, you need to come to my office. But when I explained my situation, she agreed, and I had my first therapy session. I explained the last 2 weeks in detail, and Dr. Blake asked a few questions, even asking Kitty some things. I was surprised at how much pain I felt and, at the same time, how much relief came from talking about it. After an hour, I asked Dr. Blake, what do you think I should do? Her advice was clear. You need to talk to Stacy and understand what happened, why it happened, and what she wants for the future. Then you have to decide. What's the solution? I asked. Dr. Blake said, either she wants to continue with you or she doesn't. If she does, you need to decide if your life will be better with or without her. It's so simple, I thought. She continued. If you decide your life will be better without her, then you need to get a divorce. You'll never regain the trust and love you once had. Trying to do so will hurt everyone involved. But if she wants to stay, and you believe your life will be better with her, then the real work begins. You'll have to rebuild your relationship from the ground up, every day for the rest of your life. If either of you stops giving 100%, you'll end up where you are now, and it will lead to divorce. Wow, I thought. In 3 hours on the phone, I've probably gotten 15 weeks worth of marriage counseling. But what now? How do I get through the next 24 hours, the next 3 hours? As we approached Atlanta's outer beltway, Dr. Blake offered a simple solution. Give me Stacy's phone number and I'll call her. I'll try to convince her to talk and, if possible, come to my office tonight. Tonight? I asked, startled. Yes, tonight, Dr. Blake said. The plan was for Kitty and me to go to Dr. Blake's office, where I would wait for Stacy. If she wanted to stay married, she would come. Dr. Blake emphasized that if Stacy truly believed it was a mistake and was genuinely sorry, Showing up that evening would be a positive sign for our marriage. I agreed. We had a plan. Kitty and I would meet Stacy at Dr. Blake's office. If she came, the confrontation would happen, like a showdown at the OK Corral. I'll have Kitty, and Stacy will probably bring Tony. I wish Sean could be there, but I still wasn't sure if he and Beth knew about the affair and didn't tell me. I gave Dr. Blake Stacy's phone number and got her office address. Kitty entered it into the GPS, and we told Dr. Blake we were on our way. Just before hanging up, I told Dr. Blake, "Whether Stacy agrees to come or not, I don't want to know until I get to your office." I couldn't handle hearing in the car that my marriage was over.
It had been nearly 2 weeks since I last heard from my husband, Todd. 2 of the worst weeks of my life. I had been taken advantage of, humiliated when Peter took unclothed photos of me for blackmail, and then had to confess to Todd that I slept with another man. After that, he disappeared for almost 2 weeks with no contact. Thankfully, I had good friends. Tony, my best friend, stayed by my side almost constantly during the first week, comforting me as I cried. My other friends searched for Todd and even managed to catch my rapist, forcing him to confess. After a week with no news, I decided to return to work, but it was a mistake. Everyone was talking about Peter's arrest. I truly loved Beth. She was one of the best friends anyone could have. Hearing about Peter made me break down in tears, leading my boss to call me into his office. I ended up confessing everything to him. She asked me, "Are you still in love with Todd?" After 10 more minutes of crying, I managed to say, "Yes, more than anything." If only I could tell him it was a mistake, how much I love him. I could fix this. I'm really good at fixing things. I'm your best salesperson. I could do it. My boss simply replied, "Some things are more important than work. Your faith and your family come first. Go find your husband, hug him, do whatever it takes to win him back, and prove to him that you love him even more than the day you married him. When you've done that, call me. Your position will be waiting for you. We're family and we'll support you, except for Peter." With that, I left her office to start rebuilding my marriage. The next few days were slow and painful, filled with tears, heartache, and booze to help me sleep. My friends stayed close, but despite searching, we found no trace of Todd after his call from Key West. He told Sean he was coming back, but there had been no sign of him, until the phone rang. It was around 8 p.m., and the call came from a number I didn't recognize. I thought it might be Sean and Beth calling from Key West, but since it was an unfamiliar number, I put it on speaker for Tony to hear. I prayed it was Todd. Instead, it was a woman named Dr. Blake, someone I had never heard of. Dr. Blake introduced herself and said, "I'm Todd's consultant." "Who is it?" Tony whispered. "Consultant?" I thought, confused. "How long has he been seeing a consultant? This just keeps getting worse." My mind raced with every worst-case scenario. "Does Todd have a consultant?" I asked, struggling to process the news. After a brief pause, Dr. Blake quietly said, "I'm Todd's marriage counselor." Could this get any worse? My husband had a marriage counselor, and here I was, having just confessed my infidelity. It felt like our marriage was doomed. After another pause, which I assumed Dr. Blake gave me to respond, she continued, "Todd hired me 3 hours ago, and he's on his way to my office with Kitty." "Kitty?" I repeated, confused and alarmed. "Who is Kitty?" Tony and I looked at each other, bewildered. Did Todd find someone to sleep with as revenge? Anger started to rise, and Tony quickly tried to calm me down. "Who is Kitty?" Tony asked. Dr. Blake replied, "She's his travel companion." We were both still confused, unsure what to say next. "So, why did you call?" Tony asked directly. Dr. Blake's response was straightforward. "Todd is struggling with the news you told him over a week ago. He's processing everything, trying to understand who he is, what your marriage is, and whether it has a future. He's heading to my office for a counseling session, and he asked me to invite you to join if you want to discuss whether the marriage can continue. He's not making any promises, but he's willing to listen and talk." "My office is in the Thurston building, 3rd floor, she added. "The session starts in 48 minutes. Thanks for your time. Goodbye." And with that, Dr. Blake hung up. 48 minutes. Thurston building. Kitty. Who is Kitty? 47 minutes. What should I wear? What should I say? Will he believe me? Will he divorce me? Do I have a chance? Who is Kitty? My mind was racing. I should be more thankful for having such good friends. Instead of dwelling on who Kitty was, Tony focused on what to do next. She rushed upstairs to grab my husband's favorite little black dress, along with my 4-inch heels and black tights, and told me to get dressed. She nearly yelled at me, "If you're going down, do it with dignity. Show Todd the woman he fell in love with and married." As I was getting dressed, Tony called Sean and Beth, who had just returned from a flight from Key West. She turned them around and sent them straight to the Thurston building. She said, "If I need to prove I was taken advantage of, Todd has to hear that confirmation from someone he trusts with his life." And that someone was Sean. Tony then grabbed me and shoved me into the car, telling me to start putting on my makeup. I glanced in the mirror and realized why. I had aged 15 years in the last 2 weeks. I looked worse than terrible. As we set off, trying to get there on time, I checked my watch. 42 minutes to reach the far side of Atlanta. Impossible, even at night with empty roads. I don't know how, but about 3 miles out, an Atlanta police car began following us. I heard Tony whisper, "Damn, there's a good chance of making it in 38 minutes?" I started crying when the phone rang, and Tony put it on speaker. It was Beth. She simply said, "Follow the car with the blue lights and don't stop for anything. I love you." And in an instant, a car with blue lights turned on its flashers and sped past us as if we were standing still. Once on the highway, we were doing just over 105 miles per hour. Tony could barely hold on. As we neared the Thurston building, our blue light turned off. Its lights slowed down and we passed it, pulling into the parking lot. We arrived a few minutes before the scheduled time. I rushed into the building, waited 10 seconds for the elevator, then decided to take the stairs with Tony following. Thanks to the Stairmaster, because 3 floors in 4-inch heels is a challenge. We reached the 3rd floor and ran to the office. When we opened the door, there sat a very young, attractive, well-dressed woman watching us in the lobby. We locked eyes. No one said a word. I felt like one of 2 lionesses ready to attack, each determined to be the alpha. She then stood up, walked over to me, extended her hand and said, "Hi, you must be Stacy. I'm Kitty. I've heard so much about you and your family from Todd. You're much more beautiful than he described. He's with Dr. Blake now, and they're waiting for you inside." And then she smiled.
So here I am, sitting in a very comfortable chair for 5 minutes, feeling my heart sink lower and lower, thinking Stacy won't show up. My hand shook when I met Dr. Blake and sorted out our financial matters. I also learned a bit about her 20 years of practice. She was a Duke Medical School graduate and highly respected. In the 5 minutes I'd been here, she calmed me down, assuring me we'd get through this together. I'm not alone. Then the door opened and I was face to face with my wife again. Stacy had arrived. This woman with whom I had so many loving memories that flashed through my mind like a movie on fast forward. All the highs and lows, everything. This woman turned my life upside down with a single sentence. My first thought was, she looks tired. I realized that even with makeup, she hadn't slept in a long time. She was wearing my favorite dress, her little black one with 4-inch heels. Damn, it makes her look sexy. Sexy? I thought. Sexy. Isn't that what probably got her into this mess? She probably looked sexy to someone else. And that's how her affair started. Think. Think about what Dr. Blake just said. Think. Stop letting your imagination run wild. Listen first, I reminded myself. My thoughts were tearing me apart. Shut your damn mouth and just listen to her. Stacy came to hug me and talk, but I held out my hand to stop her. I wasn't in the mood to touch her. I was still very angry, and until I heard why she betrayed me, us, our family, I didn't want her to touch me. She started crying and then sat down across from me. I looked at her, then at Dr. Blake, and wondered, is this the end? Dr. Blake spoke first. She introduced herself to Stacy and briefly discussed her experience in clinical psychology. Then she looked Stacy straight in the eyes, those same deep blue eyes I fell in love with years ago, and asked, "Can you tell Todd exactly what happened so he can understand and process it? Finish by telling Todd whether you truly want the marriage to continue or if you think it's a waste of time."
I thought, damn, this is it. He doesn't want to touch me. He doesn't want me. Well, if he doesn't want me after this, at least I can say I did everything I could. He was and still is my whole world. I looked him straight in the eye, just like the first time I saw him on the porch at that student party, and quietly said, I was pilled with something and taken advantage of at the retreat by Peter. He tried to make me believe we were having an affair, and he took unclothed photos of me to blackmail me. He was arrested, sent to prison, and confessed to everything. Beth and Sean should be here in a few minutes to confirm the story. That's the whole truth. And finally, who the hell is Kitty?
I didn't think I could be more emotional than I had been over the last 2 weeks. I was wrong. My emotions were all over the place, from one extreme to the other. This situation pushed me straight to a 10. Confusion, anger, hatred. The hatred wasn't for Stacy, but for Peter, and a lot of self-hatred. I tried to speak, but I couldn't. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I collapsed and started to cry, curling up on the floor. I couldn't take it. I cried at my wife's feet. All I could think was that I had failed her. I wasn't there to protect her.
I didn't know how to respond. My husband, my support, my lover, my life. He had spoken just 2 words to me over the last 3 weeks, and now he was curled up on the floor, crying uncontrollably. I didn't know how to respond. Which emotion was strongest within me? Was it anger? Was it disgust? Was it sympathy? Was it hatred? Was it love? This was the man I had loved for most of my life, and I had no idea how he felt. All I knew was that he was crying. I glanced at Dr. Blake, and she was staring at me with her mouth wide open. I don't think she anticipated this outcome. The doors swung open. Tony and Kitty came in to see what all the commotion was about. They just looked at me and at Todd, lying on the floor crying. A few seconds later, Sean and Beth walked in and just stood there with their mouths open, wondering what they had missed. I really didn't know what to do. It felt like we had been standing there for hours, but it had only been seconds. Kitty looked at me and asked, "What did you say to Todd?" I told her, I just told him that during my retreat, I was pilled and taken advantage of. With a trusting look in her eyes, this woman, whom I had never met and who was likely younger than my daughter, asked me, "May I handle this?" Confused by the situation and unsure if she was my husband's new mistress, I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. Okay. Kitty slowly knelt down and hugged Todd. She whispered to him, "Listen, stupid. She loved you all this time. Like I already told you, there's a good reason this happened, and it had nothing to do with you." Todd looked at her, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I heard my husband's voice. But my job was to protect her. I failed her. And when she needed me most, I failed her again when I jumped to conclusions, and again when I abandoned her. Kitty looked him straight in the eyes and firmly said, "That's nonsense. Damn it, no, it's not your fault. Sure, you should have kept it together when she first told you, but you freaked out, ran away, and look where that got you. I listened to you complain for days on the way back from Florida that if you ever had a chance to show your wife how much you loved her, you would. So get off your lazy rear, kiss your woman, and take what's yours." We all just stared at this young girl, amazed by her wisdom. Todd stood up, got down on one knee, looked me straight in the eyes, and asked, "Will you forgive me? And will you be my wife forever from this day forward?" Through tears, I replied, "Yes. Absolutely, yes. Oh God, yes, I love you. I love you so much. I missed you so much." I pulled Todd to his feet, kissed him deeply, and showed him how much I missed him. When we finally stopped kissing, I looked around and saw that everyone was still crying. Sean grabbed Todd and gave him a bear hug. Tony and Beth grabbed me and hugged me as hard as they could. I looked at Dr. Blake, who was wiping her eyes, and she said, "On one hand, my work here is done. However, on the other hand, I think we should start meeting at least twice a week. Sooner or later, it will strike you. You both will have many ups and downs, but I'm sure that in the end, you'll come out of this stronger and more in love." With that, I turned and looked at Kitty. I pulled her into my arms, not knowing who she was, but it was clear she had not only saved my husband, but also my marriage. After letting her go, I looked at Todd, hoping he would explain. All he said was, "Stacy, please let me introduce you to Tanya. In her previous life, she was known as Kitty. I know it's a lot to ask, but she needs our help."
When we eventually left Dr. Blake's office and went home, Tanya naturally came with us. This gave her the chance to officially meet Stacy and our friends. We all sat down and talked for a while. Stacy started, and her friends helped fill in the gaps. There were many moments when we couldn't hold back our emotions. Tanya and I went last and shared what had happened since I left the house. After everything was said and done, Stacy and her friends thanked Tanya for saving our marriage and practically begged her to stay in Atlanta permanently. It was Stacy who suggested Tanya move into the apartment above our garage so she could get her life in order and start pursuing her dreams. After everyone left, Stacy and I sat drinking wine and talking until morning. It was a long conversation that should have happened over a week ago. Tanya moved into the apartment above our garage. I asked her about her belongings in Florida, and she said the only important things she had were the new clothes still in the BMW. After learning about her past, Tony agreed to be her lawyer. Even though Tanya wanted nothing from the divorce, Tony made Billy pay dearly for striking her. Tanya's next challenge was returning to school. She studied hard, passed her exams, and got accepted into the prestigious Emory School of Nursing. Since it was going to be very expensive, Stacy and I offered to help with the costs and let her stay in the apartment for free until she graduated a few years later. Terry and Mike eventually found out there was a problem between Stacy and me. This came to light just before Thanksgiving when they came home and discovered Tanya living in the garage apartment. Eventually, Stacy sat them down and explained everything. She told our children that if Tanya hadn't pulled me out of my depression, I probably would have drunk myself to pass away in Key West. And for that, she owed her a great deal. It was a little awkward at first, but after a few hours, you would have thought Terry, Mike, and Tanya were siblings. Terry graduated from UNC and became a pharmacist. Mike tried his hand at AAA baseball for 2 years before taking an engineering job at a small consulting firm in Marietta. Tanya graduated from Emory with her nursing degree shortly after having her children and went to work at one of the top hospitals in Atlanta, thanks to a recommendation from her close friend, Dr. Blake. I was fortunate enough to walk both Terry and Tanya down the aisle at their weddings. As for Stacy and me, we did go through some tough times. No one can go through the kind of trauma we did without it impacting the marriage. We saw Dr. Blake for over a year. As you can imagine, there were some very unpleasant moments during that time. There was often silence, sometimes accusations, and, of course, there were fights. We made up a lot, and the sex was amazing, but it was far from easy. However, about a year later, I came home one day and noticed Stacy was no longer smoking and wasn't drinking wine on the back porch. I took it as a sign that things were getting back to normal. She no longer had nightmares, and I was fully committed every day to making our future successful. As for Peter, he eventually received parole and was released from prison several years later. Stacy was initially worried, so I suggested she see Dr. Blake on her own for a while. I was really concerned that the nightmares would return, that Stacy would start smoking again, and that everything we had worked for would fall apart. Then he just disappeared. This made Stacy even more anxious, until Beth asked to speak with her privately. Right after their conversation, Stacy felt much better. Later that evening, I asked Stacy what Beth had said. Stacy told me that Beth simply smiled at her and said, "Don't worry about him, honey. I don't think the body will ever be found."